For a long time now, I've wanted to make a video about The Lord of the Rings. To me, this trilogy is basically perfect. It's my personal favorite movie trilogy of all time, has some of the greatest and most iconic moments in cinema history, some of the greatest characters, world building, you name it, it's basically got it. So yeah, that's all. Thanks for watching, everyone. I didn't really know how to make this video because am I really just gonna sit here for around 30 to 40 minutes or however long this video is gonna end up being and talk about the greatness of this trilogy? A lot of people share the same opinions on this, so that would be an incredibly boring video. But with the new Rings of Power show, The Hobbit, the new War of the Rohirrim movie, the new Hunt for Gollum, nope, not the fan-made short film that came out years ago, the new actual movie with possibly the cast returning, the real question I have is how far off are we from this? Lord of the Rings is kind of teetering on Star Wars territory right now. A basically perfect trilogy of films that eventually went on to have a prequel series that isn't as great but still has its fans, to a TV show, now we're getting spin-off movies, and we all have to be honest right now. The more that Star Wars has come out with has done probably more harm than good to its overall reputation. So the question I pose today is this: how do we stop this from happening to The Lord of the Rings? What actually makes these films so great, and how can the future of the Lord of the Rings movies and TV shows get back on the right track to preserve and continue the legacy that these three movies have? To answer these questions, I'm going to rewatch The Lord of the Rings and act as though I've never seen these movies before. To do that, I'm going to be watching and going over the extended editions of these movies, because as many times as I've seen these movies, I've never actually had the time to sit down and watch the extended editions. Obviously, the studios are going to do whatever they want to do in order to make money, but if I can just pinpoint a few facts or aspects that these movies did so well in order to become so successful that the new Lord of the Rings projects haven't done, then I'll call this video a success. So get ready to go through the Mines of Moria, defend Helm's Deep, and maybe or maybe not destroy the One Ring as we journey through Middle-earth and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So first things first when it comes to talking about these movies, and that's pre-production. All the creative and logistical stuff that needs to happen before a film, which is usually done about a year before filming, started for The Lord of the Rings a full 3 or more years before shooting. This is where they decided to film all 3 movies back to back, how to achieve all the forced perspective with the hobbits, that Viggo would break his toe, kicking the helmet for real. All this was decided well before they ever even picked up a camera. Which is kind of point number 1 on this list as to why these films were so successful and what other movies from this series or otherwise should take note of. These movies took the proper amount of time to be prepared for everything. They had every detail of the story planned out, all the creative and logistical things that they might have run into along the way were already ready to be tackled because they had the proper time to prepare for them. Compared to something like Pirates of the Caribbean, this was very telling. Pirates of the Caribbean tried to recreate this same format with its second and third movies, but they had writers on set to try and fill in the gaps between certain scenes. They were not very prepared, and you can kind of see that in the final product. Go check out my Pirates video after this one. Another thing I have to quickly point out is how the extended editions of these movies really are just totally different movies. Usually when you see a movie that says extended edition, it'll have 2 or 3 added on scenes, maybe an alternate ending, but with the Lord of the Rings extended editions, you have additional hours to the story. Scenes that give greater context to characters and motivations, lore and history of the universe, and it really changes your perspective on quite a few things. But, and this might be a hot take, these extended editions aren't really all that needed. Sure, they're great for hardcore fans and people that want to learn more about this world and the characters in it, but these movies still swept at the Oscars and got Best Picture without it. This is why I don't really like the whole push for Snyder cuts on movies nowadays, because if the movie is good, it shouldn't need an extra 2 hours for it to actually be good. Now, I know there were some different circumstances with this case, don't come at me, Snyder fans, but in the case of The Lord of the Rings, it really is a great experience for like a second watch. But if it's your first time watching, just watch the original versions. The whole prologue of this movie does something that I actually normally hate when it comes to fantasy movies, where years of history and lore happens with a narrator telling you what happens. It just throws a whole bunch of stuff at you at once, all of it important, sure, but it can be very overwhelming. However, unlike a lot of other fantasy movie prologues, this movie makes the prologue feel like it's part of the story, not just an afterthought, so that way they can get into the actual plot of the movie. There's clearly a ton of information here, but it's told through a giant battle, through some mysterious shots that introduces the ring and Bilbo, and obviously shows us characters that will be important in the story later on. And that's one thing that this movie does extremely well. It presents a world that feels really lived in, it has a lot of history, which is something that Peter Jackson was very particular about when it came to making these films. He wanted to present the story like it's based in history instead of based in fantasy. Even just in the first act, we hear a lot about Gandalf and Bilbo's adventures, how Frodo has this great relationship with Gandalf, the kids of the Shire all really like it when he comes to town, and it feels like, even without the context of the Hobbit movies, there's a lot of history here between the characters. And before I move any further, I have to credit this movie and this series on one of the most important aspects to any story, but especially any fantasy story, and that's the music. A good soundtrack can elevate any good movie to a great movie, any okay movie to a good movie, any bad movie to an okay movie. You get the idea. Luckily though, the soundtrack to The Lord of the Rings elevates great movies to some of the greatest movies ever made. Howard Shore crafted the soundtrack to be one of the most magical and iconic pieces of music to ever grace my ears. I'll listen to the soundtrack on its own, which just prompts me to want to rewatch these movies. It's truly one of the greatest soundtracks of all time, and I just had to sing its praises as its own paragraph before moving on. As the first act continues on and Bilbo leaves, we learn about his ring, and from the audience's perspective, we know that this ring is the One Ring, but Gandalf needs to learn it too. So in a series of scenes, we see a bunch of things that not only add to the story being told, but they're all places that have a unique look that we'll travel back to over the course of the trilogy. These scenes are here to progress the story, but also tease a place that we'll be traveling back to in the future, and that's another really great aspect of this storytelling. Everything is important, and they put the story first. Every scene, both in the original and the extended versions, serve the story in a number of ways, to introduce, progress, or end a storyline, and all of the characters and places that come with it. A lot of the extra scenes in the first half serve to develop characters and places, like the Shire and Merry and Pippin, and to its credit, the Shire feels much more like a lived-in place in the extended editions. There's also the scene of Frodo and Sam trying to sleep on their travels and how uncomfortable the ground is. Necessary for the story? Not really, but it does add to the realism of the story. There's also scenes that serve as foreshadowing, like when Frodo and Sam see the elves going to the Grey Havens, never to return to Middle-earth, and Sam says that he doesn't know why, but it makes him sad to see it. Scenes like this, I feel, are actually necessary because it sets up an incredibly important plot point later on. I actually don't like how this scene was cut, and I feel like this should have been in the initial cut of the film, and I don't feel that way about a lot of these extended or cut scenes. The ring wraiths in this film are a really terrific use of horror, specifically the first time that we meet them. This scene and this shot of the four hobbits hiding while the ring wraith towers above them is iconic, and it's really the first time that we see a ring wraith up close, and these things are terrifying. The hobbits continue to run because they have no means of fighting, and every time we see the ring wraiths from here on out, there's more and more of them, making them even more frightening. Everything about their encounters with them is right out of a horror movie, and in this sense, it does feel different from the rest of the trilogy because our characters aren't exactly capable of fighting back until they meet Strider. Strider comes into the story at the perfect time, both in terms of our characters needing some help, but also for the audience to be really wary of any new characters joining because they could easily be one of Sauron's spies that Gandalf told them about. But of course, Strider ends up helping them, giving them swords and protection, but he does make them skip out on 11sies and tea time, so he's kind of a dick. Now, from a fundamental storytelling standpoint, we don't know a whole lot about Strider, how he knows about the One Ring, or why he he's doing any of this. Of course, we learn more about this Strider guy later on, but I do think it's just a bit unclear to the audience at this point in the story. When they arrive at Rivendell and Frodo heals from his wound, it really has end of the movie vibes to it. The hobbits are all happy that Frodo's alive, happy they survived their journey, Frodo reunites with Bilbo, and they all talk about how they completed their journey and how much they miss home. And funnily enough, by this point in the movie, it's been like an hour and 40 minutes or something like that, so it could be its own movie by itself. And that is kind of the whole point of the scene, but it's really the point where we're introduced to the other half of the cast. When Elrond and his council all meet, it's honestly a masterfully crafted scene because it shows us everything we need to know about each character. Boromir is brash and arrogant, Legolas is fiercely loyal, Aragorn is humble and smart, Gimli takes action to try and destroy the ring himself, which also shows the audience that it really can't be destroyed by just smashing it. It also shows Legolas and Gimli at odds with one another and Boromir doubting Aragorn. This is just a masterfully crafted scene that introduces and sets character arcs into motion in the most perfect way possible. Again, everything is important. Kind of a side note here, but I absolutely hate how bitter Elrond is. He doesn't want the ring in Rivendell, he doesn't like that Aragorn's banging his daughter, and this all stems from his own guilt about the ring not being destroyed. He was there, he could have killed Isildur and thrown his whole body in the lava, and none of this would be happening. But I think this bitterness and this aggravation from myself actually makes a lot of sense for the character of Elrond. I like how later on we see that Aragorn is willing to fight or kill Boromir if he doesn't give up the ring. It shows that Aragorn really doesn't want to be like Isildur, and he's also learned from Elrond's mistakes as well. When the Fellowship sets off on the journey, you get some nice bonding moments like Merry and Pippin training with Boromir, but I like how everything seems to go wrong almost immediately. They go south, but that path is being watched by Saruman's spies. They go up the mountains, but it's too cold and prone to avalanches due to Saruman's yodeling, so they go to the mines, and even that isn't a great option until it's forced to be their only option. I know they said this journey wasn't going to be easy, but this seems a bit excessive. The Mines of Moria as a whole is probably my favorite sequence of the movie. It obviously has some great moments of action, but it also has great tension and character building moments. It's also the first time we get to see how well or how terrible the Fellowship actually works as a team. The ending sequence with Gandalf versus the Balrog is probably the most iconic scene from this entire series, and it's also one of the greatest and most moving death scenes in any movie ever. I also think now is a good time to talk about Frodo and how he is one of the most incapable protagonists of all time. Frodo is talked about in the same light as Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter, but when you look at the sheer achievements of these three, Frodo absolutely pales in comparison. I'll continue talking about Frodo as the trilogy goes on, but let's recap so far. He gets stabbed by a ring wraith and almost dies. He puts on the ring, albeit accidentally, but he wants to put it on before that. He gets wrapped up by the Kraken outside Moria, needing to be saved yet again. Then inside the mines, he gets stabbed again, but this time he has a magical shirt on that saves him. So far, Frodo ain't looking too great as a main character, but, I'm sure he'll have his own heroic moments coming up. Right? I feel like every time I see the Woods of Lothlorien scene, I pick up on something new, but mostly because I find this whole sequence to be, how do I put it? I don't want to say boring, but definitely slow. I think the combination of Gandalf's death and all the heavy action that we had just seen makes this whole sequence just a bit tough to follow, personally. I'm not sure what it is, but I find that I'm usually forcing myself to pay attention through this scene. But on this new extended edition watch, I definitely picked up on a few more things. 1, Sam sings a little song in honor of Gandalf's fireworks, and 2, Galadriel gives out gifts like it's Christmas, not just the nightlight to Frodo. It's where Aragorn gets his dagger, the hobbits get their cloaks, Legolas his new bow, and sure, a lot of these things might not be necessary to show, but it's also cool to see how these things came into their possession. But the entire third act at Amon Hen is obviously incredible. Frodo gets the warning from both Galadriel and Gandalf that he can't trust anyone, and that proves to be true because Boromir gets corrupted by the ring, and Aragorn is the one who realizes that this truly is a journey that Frodo must do on his own. But of course, as Frodo goes to escape, what does he do? He trips and falls over a bush. But this fight and Aragorn going 1v50 against the Uruk-hai until Legolas and Gimli show up is so insanely badass. After watching a lot of the battle sequences from Game of Thrones, I thought that they outshined any other medieval fantasy battles, and from a semi-realistic standpoint, that may be true, but when it comes to entertainment and that sheer badass factor, Lord of the Rings is still the one true king. Boromir's death is once again one of the more moving death scenes that I've ever watched. He has an almost perfect redemption arc from being arrogant and, in a way, selfish for his kingdom type of man, to realizing his wrongs and doing everything he can to protect the hobbits, ultimately failing, but still, the guy was fighting with 2 arrows sticking out of his chest. Boromir is an incredibly tragic character, and I know that we get to see more of him in the extended editions in the future, so I'll talk more about Boromir there when we see him. But for him to recognize Aragorn as his king in his dying moments actually does more for Aragorn's character development than it does for Boromir. Aragorn was incredibly cautious of Boromir the entire movie, but for this guy to come back from his own nature shows Aragorn that there still is strength in the race of men. The ending of this movie, and I mean the very end, right when it goes to the credits, there's something so magical about this ending. With a combination of the entire movie, the emotional moments, the music, there's something about this moment right here that right when I see the directed by credits, I get chills. It never fails, it happens every time. I'm sure editing this, I've gotten chills like 50 times, and that's because this movie really is just so special. I'm gonna give The Fellowship of the Ring a 9.5 out of 10. I love how Gandalf says that swords are no longer of any use against the Balrog, but that's exactly what he uses to fight the Balrog at the beginning of this movie. Personally, I think he just wanted this kill all to himself. Again, throughout this film, a lot of the additional scenes serve to further along character development or add in more details about the world or the situations going on. Like right at the start of the movie, there's a scene with Elvish rope that is pretty comical, but adds some more character growth to Sam in the process. While I do like these scenes, I feel like a lot of them make sense to me as to why they were cut, whether it's because it disrupts the pacing or just doesn't progress the story at all. Remember, everything is important, so if it doesn't serve the story all that much, it can be cut. However, this doesn't always ring true in this movie. Some of these extended scenes are so great, and it was honestly so great to hear more insight into these characters' thoughts and motives, even if it did disrupt the pacing. Watching the extended editions gives these characters so much more personality, and it makes you care for them so much more. At first, I was kind of ashamed that I had never seen these versions. I wasn't kind of debating on even saying that in the beginning, but as I was watching them, it really did feel like I was watching these movies for the first time again, and it was such a great experience. We're also very quickly introduced to one of the greatest characters ever put to screen, and that's Andy Serkis's Gollum. It's very easy to see why Andy Serkis became the king of motion capture roles, and even just as much of a sought-after actor in general after these movies. His performance as Gollum/Smeagol is incredible, one of the best in this series and maybe even of all time. It's definitely important to note that without this role and a lot of the technological advancements that this series had, roles like Caesar and even King Kong wouldn't exist. Another thing to remember when it comes to these movies is that they are adapted from books. However, the way books in general are structured and paced can be very different from the way films are, so that presented another big challenge when adapting this movie in particular. Peter Jackson and his team said that The Two Towers was the hardest movie to edit because it didn't have a proper beginning or end for any of the storylines. In the book, the entire structure is very different. If they had done this in the movie, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas' story would have been the entire first half, then everything with the hobbits would be afterwards, and that just doesn't really work in a film. So the first half of this film, while it doesn't feel jumbled or badly paced at all, you can definitely really feel that difficulty as to where they should cut scenes, where they should introduce different plots and people, and how to really bring all of this together. This is another point that made this trilogy so great, and that's the editing. This could very easily have been a total mess of a first half of a movie. In fact, this entire movie and the next movie could have been a complete and total mess if it hadn't been for the structure that they found and the way that they edited these films together. Now, I'm not too sure if this is something that studio executives can work on. I think in this aspect it really comes down to the talent of the director and editor as to where to place scenes, but editing really is a very big underrated part of the industry, and I actually know that there's not too many editors in the business, so if you like editing, you could help the film industry a ton if you become great. And while I'm at it, music is also incredibly important, so any musicians out there, keep going. Like any sequel, the story gets bigger and expands quite a bit, and with this, like any sequel, comes some complications. This film becomes much more of a fantasy world compared to the first one. A lot of the things introduced can feel a bit overwhelming, and all of these introductions do make sense if Hobbiton is supposed to be far away from most things magical, but if you were watching this expecting some sort of grounded political thriller between Rohan and Gondor, you're gonna be disappointed. Now, I'm not sure who would be expecting a political drama, but I'm sure the Game of Thrones crowd who was told to watch Lord of the Rings afterwards was probably disappointed to some degree. In this film, you have the Ents, magical spells, dragons, the dead marshes, which used to, and still absolutely does, give me nightmares. Seriously, when I watched this when I was like a 7-year-old kid, I had never quite seen anything like this before, and this image is seeped into my brain and nightmares. So thanks a lot, Peter Jackson, and I guess Mom. Personally, I don't see any of this as a problem because I like fantasy and I think that everything is introduced with purpose and explained thoroughly, but it's something that comes with the territory of fantasy. High concepts that can really make or break a story, and of course, the new fantasy elements don't break this story whatsoever. So with Gandalf's return, I don't get it. Maybe it's because I don't understand the complex history of this character or the lore around the wizards, but to me this scene, even in the extended edition, just seems like a big, complicated way of bringing back a beloved character. So to any and all Tolkien experts out there, please explain it to me like I'm 5 in the comments below. Even with all the split storylines in this film, there's no denying that this movie really belongs to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. I mean, the game for this movie only lets you play as those 3 characters anyway. It's also a super underrated game. But a large part of the second act doesn't even cut away from their storyline whatsoever. Almost from the time that they meet Gandalf again to the time they end up leaving Edoras, maybe there's like a scene or two that breaks from their point of view, but that's it. And now I think is a great time to talk about Aragorn. Now, I may have a large bias here, but Aragorn is, to me, the greatest fictional hero of all time. He's incredibly smart, loyal, courageous, humble, and a through and through leader. He's got the perfect hero arc. When we meet him, he resents his own destiny because he doesn't want to share the same fate as Isildur. He doesn't want to be tempted by the ring, so he lets Frodo go in order to go and help elsewhere, and of course, eventually accepts who he is and who he can become to inspire those around him. Aragorn was always the character in the series that I looked up to and was inspired by as a child. But interestingly enough, there's even more emphasis on Aragorn in the extended version than there is in the theatrical version. Gandalf tells Aragorn that Sauron is scared of Aragorn and who he can become. Saruman learns that Aragorn is Isildur's heir, so he's also a bit scared of him, even though he doubts Aragorn is who he says he is. I know Frodo is the protagonist who goes on the hero's journey, but the more I watch these films, definitely with the extended versions, the more I feel like Aragorn is the true protagonist. He's not the true hero of the story though, that's someone else, but I'll get to that later on. The next thing I have to talk about is another really important aspect in the success of this trilogy, and that's keeping true to the source material. Does that mean this is the perfect adaptation, that everything from the books was kept in and there were 0 changes? No, it doesn't. There's plenty of changes, some for the better, others not so much. But what this adaptation does is respect the original work. Any of the changes that were made were for simplicity's sake, not to change the intentions or words of the author. This is an especially huge point for not only the Lord of the Rings success, but all future successful adaptations. For all the House of the Dragon fans out there, I think we all know how upset George R.R. Martin is with the second season, and it's because that story isn't staying true to the author's intentions. And with this comes quite a bit of fan backlash as well. I think that's one of the things about the Rings of Power that audiences hate the most right now, because it just doesn't feel like Tolkien's work. These films aren't perfect in that regard either, don't get me wrong. Some people don't like how Gimli is reduced to a comic relief character because in the books he's quite serious, but I think this is a change more so to differentiate the characters and give them more personality, not to change the core of the character. I think this is something that a lot of modern stories are really getting wrong. They just don't really respect the source material and are using this huge brand or IP in order to tell their own story with their own message. Speaking of Gimli, let's talk about his development with Legolas, because this dynamic and this partnership is really at the core for both of their developments. From where they started to where they are in this movie is completely different. They start off screaming at each other and Legolas is super bummed that Gimli joins the Fellowship, to this movie where somebody vaguely threatens Gimli and Legolas almost kills him. During Helm's Deep, they have a lot of playful banter, and this is a really great storyline to have in these movies that's very symbolic. Despite your past history of differences, you can always move past them, especially if it's the past generations that had difficulty and not yourselves personally. I think it's a very strong message that rings true today. This movie also introduces us to our second and final major female character, and that's Éowyn. Now this girl has the hots for Aragorn, and honestly, I don't blame her. She gets attached to him as quickly, or maybe even quicker than I did, and again, I don't blame her. There is this sort of love triangle between Aragorn, Arwen, and Éowyn. We get a flashback to Aragorn breaking up with Arwen so she can move on and go to the Grey Havens, but even then, Aragorn still isn't breaking his loyalty to her, and I respect that quite a lot. But Éowyn is really only introduced here as somebody who craves to be treated as an equal. She says that she fears to be put in a metaphorical cage. She wishes to fight with the men against the wargs and at Helm's Deep, but Theoden refuses. I actually think that Éowyn has a much better and more concrete character arc than Arwen does. Even though I like Arwen and Aragorn more, I do wish that we got to see more of Arwen in this trilogy. During the few times that we do catch up with the hobbits, we see that Frodo and Sam get captured by the men of Gondor, including Faramir. In these extended editions, we get to see more of Faramir and Boromir's relationship, how Boromir was actually a very great captain and an honorable man who looked out for his younger brother. Faramir is riddled with daddy issues and is just trying to please his father, which sets up a very interesting character arc for him in the rest of this movie and the rest of the trilogy. These flashback scenes do very much disrupt the pacing of the movie. It does add a lot to the story, but I can absolutely see why they were probably the first things cut out of this already 3-hour-long movie. They just aren't quite needed to understand everything, especially when we see more of Faramir's relationship with his father in the next movie. But with how little we actually see of this storyline, I think it definitely enhances a lot of Faramir's character. I also can't help but wonder how the storyline would have turned if Faramir had gone to Elrond's council instead of Boromir. Boromir really was much better suited staying in Gondor and holding Osgiliath, and Faramir might have been more true to the Fellowship, or he might have taken even more drastic action to try and steal the ring and please his father. I'm not too sure, but it's definitely interesting to think about. The third storyline that's basically been going on for the whole movie is Merry and Pippin with Treebeard. Out of all three storylines, this one feels like it drags the most, especially in the extended version. There's an additional 4 or 5 scenes of this storyline that truly don't add anything to this story. I've never actually felt that this storyline was bad or anything, but with all of the extra scenes, it really started to feel like Damon at Harrenhal. Okay, maybe not that bad, but it does drag a lot. Obviously, the ending and the last march of the Ents at Isengard is really cool. It's great symbolic payback for Saruman to leave his home largely undefended and for nature to get its payback against him. But now we talk about the big part of the movie, and that's of course the Battle of Helm's Deep. There's this air of hopelessness when they arrive at Helm's Deep. The scene of the soldiers choosing the older and younger men to fight and arming them with all kinds of weapons is really sad, and you truly believe there's just no way that they win this fight. Aragorn and Legolas also have a little spat that probably didn't help with the group morale when Aragorn says he'll die among everybody else, so the odds of winning this fight just don't seem that great. That is until the elves arrive. I know this is something that doesn't actually happen in the books, but I think it's an excellent change. Just the way the scenes feel, you can tell that everybody gets like a +10 morale boost when the elves arrive. It shows people coming together to fight a common enemy, it's great for entertainment purposes, overall it's a really great decision. When the Uruk-hai arrive, I'll never forget the tension I felt the first time that I watched this scene. It's still an outmatched fight, but the tension built here never fails to put me in that moment and just be completely and totally enthralled by this battle. What truly works about Helm's Deep is how they're losing the entire time and it's really no contest, but there are small moments of hope and victory that persist throughout. Whether it's Gimli and Legolas playing their game, Gimli jumping down on top of the Uruks, Legolas riding a shield like a skateboard, Aragorn and Gimli fighting on the causeway. There's so many moments, and the men and the elves are losing at an alarming rate, but there's small victories here and there that inspire hope in the audience and the characters, even when all seems lost. This battle is also intercut with scenes of the hobbits, all at wildly different points in their storylines. The battle starts when Merry and Pippin haven't even met any of the other Ents, and the Battle of Helm's Deep ends when all of the Ents destroy Isengard. In the extended version, the battle is quite literally a third of the movie. Helm's Deep is an absolute massive battle sequence, but it never gets boring, and you also never get battle fatigue from it either. Everything that happens is important, and it's not just mindless action for the sake of it. This is my all-time favorite battle in any movie or TV show. The lighting, the rain, the strategy, it's all just so impressive and entertaining. There is another very emotional death for Haldir, and it's filmed kinda in the same emotional vein as Boromir and Gandalf's death, but I just truly don't care about Haldir that much as a character. I mean, we don't really know too much about him. It's still a sad death because he's the one who brought the elves to defend Helm's Deep in the first place, but it's nowhere near as effective as Boromir or Gandalf's deaths were. Speaking of Gandalf, him bringing the Rohirrim to save the day at the last moment is such a great and triumphant scene, even if it eventually led to a bunch of copycat scenes like it. The ending of Frodo and Sam's story with Faramir ultimately being the better person and letting them go, Sam saving Frodo from the Ringwraith, and of course Sam's speech intercut with the endings of the other two storylines is a phenomenal scene. It really brings together the message of hope that the movie spreads, and seeing everything come together, even if it is just a smaller victory for Frodo and Aragorn, is a really great ending for this movie. And again, hats off to the editing team for finding a solid ending point for these stories that wasn't the ending point in the books. The actual ending scene, once again, gives me chills every time I see it, leaving the movie off on Gollum's incredibly mysterious and devious plan, and seeing that Frodo and Sam are getting closer to their goal, while also getting our first glimpse of what Mordor truly looks like since the prologue of the first movie, is a really chilling ending. Even though we never actually really see this version of Mordor again with all the lightning and storms in it. Overall, I found the extended edition of this movie to be a bit hit or miss. There's a lot of greater context added for characters and even some new revelations, but I don't think that a lot of it is really needed. So for this movie, I'll probably stick to the theatrical versions on most of my future rewatches, but this movie is still an incredibly solid 9 out of 10. Starting the movie off with Smeagol's whole backstory and him turning into Gollum is really a tone setter for how this movie is going to turn out. We see exactly what the ring does to people and how, regardless of how close you are to the situation, it doesn't turn out too happy. This is also far and away the darkest scene of the entire trilogy thematically, and I think probably the darkest scene in the entire Lord of the Rings on-screen universe so far, maybe ever, because this is definitely a really dark scene. The opening minutes of the extended edition have one of the bigger changes in the story when it comes to the theatrical versus the extended version, and that's of course Saruman's end. It's also one of the stranger omissions from the theatrical version, because without it, Saruman's character kind of just goes away. There's no real resolution for this major villain of the franchise. This brings me to my conversation about villains in The Lord of the Rings in general. Villains are one of those key factors where you can tell these books were written a long time ago. J.R.R. Tolkien, what on earth were you thinking when you named the main villain Sauron and another evil character who teams up with him, Saruman? And really, Gandalf, you didn't see this one coming from like a mile away. As for Sauron, I've always kind of had mixed feelings about him as a character or entity. Does it make him scarier that we never actually see him in his physical form again? I mean, sure, I guess so. Does it also feel a bit strange that this story doesn't really have a concrete villain with complex motives and a personality? Yeah, it does. I've never really given Sauron much thought because he's more of just this evil entity controlling everything, and as perfect as these movies are, I do find it strange that Sauron isn't really much of a villain. One thing I've always loved about The Return of the King is that it's still very much focused on expanding the story. Sometimes, and I'd even say most times when it comes to third movies and trilogies, well, they aren't good, but that's besides the point. Most third movies and trilogies are primarily focused on wrapping things up. The characters largely stay the same and are at the closing of their arcs, often referring back to things from the first movie in the trilogy or concluding the story setup from the second movie. But hardly is there as much change in the story or the characters as there is in The Return of the King. And I'm not saying that this movie doesn't give proper conclusions, because it does, and it does it very well. But I guess all this is just the perks of having a 3-hour theatrical runtime. But still, my point remains the same, and that's another point as to why this trilogy worked so well, and that's satisfying character arcs. Almost every major and side character goes on a journey that brings their appearances and motivations in all 3 movies together in a way that feels incredibly earned and satisfying. And there's also a lot of side characters who are promoted to more prominent roles in this film. Merry, Pippin, Éowyn, Faramir, Theoden, even Legolas and Gimli to an extent are given much more to do in this film than they were in previous films. In particular, I want to point out Merry and Pippin, whose storylines I particularly enjoyed in this viewing. Maybe it was the extended edition, or maybe it was because I found myself disappointed by their extended storyline in the last film, but I think separating them and giving them their own storylines in unique locations with other side characters promoted all of them and their stories to a more prominent role. Pairing Gandalf and Pippin together was especially great, considering how Gandalf seems to hate Pippin, but when they're together in smaller and even bigger moments, it proves that Gandalf isn't actually this grumpy old man who just hates Pippin. But it's not just this storyline either. Theoden letting go of his past squabbles with Gondor to answer the call once the beacons are lit, Merry pledging his service to Theoden and then tying that into Éowyn's storyline. These are all much bigger storylines for characters who were just side characters in the last movie. And speaking of Éowyn, at the beginning of this movie there's still some of that love triangle with her and Aragorn, but I think she realizes that it's not going to happen and moves on with her life and gets a much more prominent storyline away from the love triangle, and I think that's great. I also want to take this time to talk about Gandalf, and specifically his use of magic. Growing up, I was a fan of both Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, but I was extremely disappointed that Gandalf's staff didn't work the way that Harry's wand does. That didn't sound right, but the fact that Gandalf wasn't casting spells and shooting out sparks of red lightning really disappointed me. But in my old age, I actually really like how Gandalf's magic is used and seen. It's not all that explained, but we of course see the times where he's far more powerful than anyone or anything else, even when it seems like he's just using light or a shield. I like how mystical and mysterious all of this magic really is. Frodo, Sam, and Gollum's story this time around is much more entertaining and interesting. While I think Frodo gets a pretty deserved bad rap, I do want to credit Elijah Wood for showing us just how affected Frodo has become by the ring. We're told throughout the series that the ring is a great burden, but we really see how different Frodo is, even just compared to the last movie, and how easy it is for Gollum to come in between Sam and Frodo. And everything involving Shelob's lair really does feel like the climax of the story. I mean, besides the actual destroying of the ring, but all of the tensions between the characters comes to a head in Shelob's lair, and for those that don't know, this whole sequence actually happens in the second book, not the third. But I think moving it around and placing it here actually works far better, especially when the pacing of the movie and the trilogy is concerned. This also helps solidify who the true hero of the story is, and that's of course... Wait, I'm still getting ahead of myself. Faramir's whole storyline with at first trying to hold Osgiliath, and then retreating back to Minas Tirith to then meet Gandalf and Pippin is really great. I love when different storylines connect together like this, and the different dynamics are presented with how much characters have grown. Faramir and Pippin have a pretty great dynamic, but if Faramir hadn't met Frodo and Sam, they might not have had any sort of back and forth whatsoever. This whole storyline also leads to Pippin's song, which is one of the greatest scenes in the movie, and that's really saying something. For the first, hour and a half, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli don't actually do all that much, but that's mainly because the entire Rohan storyline takes a back seat in favor of the Gondor story, which makes sense because while everything is going on with Faramir, Gandalf, and Pippin, we're also being introduced to Gondor and Minas Tirith as a whole. But when they are given another prominent storyline, I do think it's kind of funny that they just go on some side quest to get a ghost army. From a strictly storytelling perspective, this whole haunted mountain and ghosts really comes out of nowhere and seems awfully convenient, both in the sense that it gives Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli something to do, but it also leads to the most powerful army in Middle-earth. Don't get me wrong, I still really dig it. I think it's a cool storyline to follow, but it does just kinda happen and appears at a really convenient time. However, Elrond arriving with Arundel and really being that last piece that convinces Aragorn to become the person he must be, gives Elrond's character a full circle moment, and also gives Aragorn this cool new sword. But Aragorn could at the very least tell someone where he's going and why, instead of seemingly abandoning everybody on the eve of battle. The whole Paths of the Dead sequence itself is okay, not nearly as great or action-packed as the video game version. I also still say I do not fear death when walking into a dark part of my house after watching a horror movie. The entire first half of this movie is really setting up the siege of Minas Tirith, and just like Helm's Deep, there's this air of hopelessness around the entire situation. As the siege begins, Gondor seems to just be getting slaughtered. Even though Rohan is on the way, we're still told those numbers aren't enough. So it comes down to Aragorn getting this ghost army, but even when he gets them, the whole way the sequence is edited, you just aren't really sure if they're even going to get there in time. This is also a part of the extended edition that I actually didn't like that much. In the theatrical version, there's a bigger air of mystery and suspense around these scenes, so when they actually do arrive and the army is with them, it's a much more triumphant moment. The siege also feels pretty grounded for a fantasy battle. It takes up hours of in-universe time, days turn to night, then back to day again, and of course this sequence is directed masterfully. When Rohan does arrive, it gives Gondor hope, it gives the audience hope, but just like Helm's Deep, these victories are small. Especially when the Oliphants arrive, it seems like maybe all of this was for nothing. I also like how Rohan arrives and saves Gandalf, whereas in Helm's Deep, it was the reverse. When Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli do arrive, it's what gives everyone the hope that there actually can be a victory at hand. I think this entire first, 2/3 of the movie and this siege is such a triumphant high that no other battle has ever really been able to achieve. It's moving, emotional, epic, intense, and there really hasn't been anything like it. I think maybe the Endgame battle comes close to recreating this, but that was after 10 years and 24 movies. The Lord of the Rings had 3 movies to do this. And I think all this comes down to personal preference in some ways, but regardless, to achieve something this emotional is truly an amazing achievement. But after all that's said and done, we enter the third act, which truly belongs to Frodo, Gollum, and of course, Sam. Yes, everyone, it's time to talk about the true hero of The Lord of the Rings, Samwise Gamgee. As great as Aragorn is, even though Frodo is the ring bearer, the true hero of this story is Sam. Let's recap, shall we? Sam lives a quaint life in the Shire when he's forced to leave his home by Gandalf and tasks him with not letting Frodo out of his sight. Sam takes this job incredibly seriously, and despite not really wanting to leave home, he agrees because he wants to protect Frodo. Whenever Frodo is in the slightest bit of danger, Sam is always front and center to try and take on the challenge, even when he's severely underleveled. Frodo attempts to leave everyone, including Sam, behind, so Sam, despite not being able to swim, risks his own life to try and get over to Frodo because he made a promise to Gandalf. Then they meet Gollum, and Sam has those protective, motherly instincts active because he just doesn't trust Gollum one bit. Frodo, on the other hand, wants to keep him around, so Sam just kinda has to keep his mouth shut. As Frodo gets tempted by the ring more and more, Sam is always the one to bring Frodo back and keep him grounded and inspire him to go on. Without Sam, by the end of the Two Towers, Frodo would have been killed about a dozen or more times. Now with Return of the King, we find out that Sam has been planning and saving enough resources for a journey home, something Frodo hadn't even considered. Sam also correctly uncovers Gollum's evil plans, but Frodo still takes Gollum's side, even deserting Sam in the process. Sam, though, recovers quickly and realizes that Frodo still needs his help, so he walks right into the belly of Shelob's lair, faces off against Shelob, which is, yes, a giant, scary-looking spider, but also an ultra-powerful cosmic entity that is just taking the shape of a spider, and Sam wins this fight. This would be enough for him to be the hero, but then he single-handedly attacks a fortress to get Frodo back and return the ring to him. When they finally reach Mount Doom, Frodo quite literally can't walk himself anymore, so Sam carries him the rest of the way, fighting off Gollum in the process to give Frodo the time he needs to destroy the ring, which he doesn't even do. Without Sam, Frodo doesn't even make it to Rivendell, much less Mordor. Sam is loyal, cheerful, inspirational, and the exact partner you'd need for this journey, and the only person that could have helped Frodo achieve this mission single-handedly. We all need a Sam in our lives, and if you are the Sam in other people's lives, then just know you are the true hero of other people's story. Sam is the true hero of The Lord of the Rings, and if you disagree, then good luck trying to disagree with J.R.R. Tolkien himself. Now, with all that said and done, I think some of the extended scenes of Faramir and Éowyn are completely unnecessary, borderline bad. It truly takes away from the moment, and I really think that both of them should have been at the Battle of the Black Gate, and it's honestly my least favorite aspect of these extended editions, and I'm really happy that these moments were cut out. There's another kind of weirdly edited moment of Aragorn using the Palantir to speak to Sauron about how much Sauron has wanted to face Aragorn, and now, I'm gonna say a pretty hot take here. During the editing process, Aragorn was originally supposed to face a physical Sauron on the battlefield, but it was replaced with a troll. Peter Jackson said that fighting Sauron isn't Aragorn's point, it's just for him to buy time for Frodo. I actually don't agree with this. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who am I to disagree with Peter Jackson? And with that sentiment, we do agree. I'm nobody to disagree with Peter Jackson. But this whole series starts off with Isildur defeating Sauron, and in these extended editions, it's made out that Sauron is scared of Aragorn because Aragorn poses the major threat to him. I feel like Aragorn facing Sauron, having overcome his own temptation for the ring in the past, and being the rightful and just king of Gondor, to fight Sauron would show that Sauron was far more concerned with his own ambitions and selfish need to destroy Aragorn than getting the ring back. And I think that that would have been really great. It would have shown that Aragorn's distraction was truly worth it, not that it isn't already, but just to see the king fight the main villain would just be another great addition and bring the character arcs full circle. I'm not ultimately that upset about it not being in here, but I do think it would have been great nonetheless. I don't think it would have taken away from Frodo and Sam's moment at all. The actual climb to Mount Doom and everything that comes from it always feels so incredibly earned. In combination of the character arcs, the emotional beats like Sam giving his speech about carrying Frodo, seeing how broken Frodo truly is in his final temptations and confronting Gollum, the music, everything involved just always makes this sequence, stay with me here, the greatest sequence in all of cinema history. Yes, that's right, you heard me, the greatest sequence of all time. I always feel like I'm watching this scene for the first time whenever I do a rewatch of the trilogy. This scene makes the entire journey feel so heavy, like it was just such a burden for Frodo. It makes all of Frodo's less than spectacular scenes feel really emotional because of what he was going through. Him eventually giving into the power of the ring is really tragic and unexpected because it's not something the traditional fantasy hero would do. These scenes and the ending never fail to make me feel really emotional. It really makes the 9-hour journey to get here feel worth it just to see these scenes and feel the way that you do when you watch them. The reunions after the destruction of the ring are always really heartwarming, but it takes me out of it every time when Legolas comes in, and I really don't even think Frodo remembers who he is. He says everybody else's name besides Legolas, and I find that hilarious. But I think what might be the most powerful shot in the movie is, no, not when everybody bows to the hobbits, that is a great moment, but I think it's when all the hobbits return to the Shire, sit down at the bar like they used to, but things just aren't the same. They can't just return to living the lives that they used to because this experience they all shared was really traumatic, especially for Frodo, who tells us in his books that there are some wounds that time cannot heal, some hurts that are too deep and have taken hold. Watching this as a kid, you don't really understand why everything can't just go back to the way it was before the ring, but as an adult, while I've never been through anything as traumatic as Frodo, this ending still hits a completely different way. This is a very bittersweet ending. It's not quite happy or sad, but it feels very real, which is a really crazy thing to say considering what this trilogy is, but that brings me to my last point as to why this trilogy was so successful. It's emotionally resonant. Despite taking place in a fictional world with fictional people and fictional conflicts, we can all see ourselves in these characters. We can all relate in some strange way to the happenings and how the characters feel about certain events. We can all take our own messages out of the things that happen without a message being forced upon us. Maybe you have your own understanding of why Frodo chose to leave and go to the Grey Havens. Maybe you think he's just being soft for leaving his friends behind, but watch it again in a few years and you might feel differently. This movie is a certified 10 out of 10. There will never be another movie like it. So what went right with the Lord of the Rings trilogy as opposed to everything else we've seen from the Lord of the Rings in recent years? Number 1. Preparation. These movies were in pre-production for 5 years before they shot anything. Making a film is not as simple as writing a script, getting a camera, and saying action. We all know this, but there's an even higher degree of preparation when it comes to something like The Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter, or Marvel and DC. I've talked a lot about failed franchises recently, and a lot of those fail because they get this first step wrong, and the product they end up creating is riddled with issues that could have been prevented had they taken their preparation more seriously. Number 2. Everything is important. Every scene, every location, every character introduced, all of this is purposeful. Both the theatrical and extended versions of these movies make each and every scene serve the story being told. It's not trying to be some roundabout way of teaching a life lesson or have a very in-your-face theme. Everything shown on screen is to make you feel more attached to this world and the things inside of it. Once you're attached to this world and the people in it, you can take your own themes and messages away from it. Nowadays, it seems that some of the story on screen is trying to be indicative of things in our world or things that just aren't that necessary to world building or the characters. They put the story of this trilogy first, and it showed in the final product. Number 3, the editing and music. This one I feel might be a bit obvious, but having good editing and music can really make or break a film. Watching the extended editions of these movies really made me appreciate the editing of this trilogy even more. A lot of the extra scenes, while they might be fun for the hardcore fan of The Lord of the Rings, I'd say like 90% of them aren't that necessary. They just break up the pacing of the movie, the tone of the scenes at hand, and overall just don't prove to be that useful to the story they were telling. And when you have movies that are all around 3 hours long, pacing and editing are super important to keep people engaged for that long. I never feel bored watching The Lord of the Rings. I know that might be different for some contrarians out there, but getting together a good edit for movies that are this long really is not something to be undervalued. A lot of the issues I have with a lot of failed franchises is the pacing for their movies feeling a bit all over the place. That could have so easily been the case with The Lord of the Rings, but thankfully it isn't. As for music, I don't really have any wise words for how to make great music. I know it's great when I hear it, like in the case for The Lord of the Rings, but I don't play any instruments. I think music and musicians are the coolest thing ever because I don't have any sort of skill or expertise there. But for the case of the video, just make good music for your movies. Come on, can't be that hard. Right? Number 4, keeping true to the source material. Lord of the Rings, like most fantasy stories on screen, are adapted from books, which is why it's so important to have actual fans of the source material on these kinds of projects. You can be the greatest writer in the world trying to adapt a beloved series of books, but if you don't have any sort of love or connection to those stories, you might be fine cutting out different aspects or scenes that the fans love and will then hate you for. You can be an alright writer with a lot of love for the story and end up making a great final product. I brought it up earlier, so I'll bring it up again with Game of Thrones. David Benioff and D.B. Weiss were not these ultra-experienced writers or producers or anything. Benioff's biggest credit was on X-Men Origins Wolverine, for crying out loud. But what did they have? A lot of love and respect for George R. R. Martin's world, and for the first 4 seasons, they were excellent at adapting his material to screen. After that, well, we all know how it goes, but this really proves that having respect and love for the source material is really incredibly important to having a successful franchise, and something that The Lord of the Rings has kind of lost in recent years. Number 5, satisfying character arcs. This is an incredibly important one that I know has been lost in recent years. Stories nowadays are so concerned with trying to break the mold of past fantasy stories to misdirect you into thinking things are going one way when they are in fact going the other way, and sometimes this works, but I'd say most of the time it doesn't work or it's stopped working. There's a mold for a reason. It works, and there are still ways to go outside of the mold while also delivering a satisfying character arc for the character. Frodo makes this entire journey, sacrifices so many different things during this time, only to get there and say, yeah, never mind, I'm not destroying the ring. He succumbs to the ring in those final moments, only for the ring to be destroyed anyway, and for all of this to leave a scar that never properly heals, both mentally and physically. Everybody hails Frodo as this hero who destroyed the ring, when he knows that's not really true. This is still a satisfying character arc for Frodo, even though it doesn't end the way the traditional hero's journey ends. It's breaking the mold while still staying within the mold, if that makes sense. Imagine if this entire trilogy was setting up Aragorn to take Gondor's throne, and then at the end he just says, actually, I want my own ring. I'm gonna go and make myself a new ring. You'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? Where did all this come from? This isn't what we wanted at all. And make no mistake, what the audience wants to see in a story is of vital importance. Yes, even fan service moments are important to see. Lord of the Rings really nailed all these satisfying character arcs, and we need to get back to having satisfying ends, having actual character arcs, not character circles. Number 6, emotionally resonant. This last point is truly one of the things that I think makes The Lord of the Rings so special. I've been watching these movies since I was 7 years old. I've loved seeing all the battles and the cool magical stuff in the world, but I remember thinking that the ending was really sad for no reason. They destroyed the ring. All evil is gone from the world. Why isn't everything happy? But the older you get, the more you understand the ending of this trilogy. You understand that some journeys you go on in life leave scars, some that will never heal properly, that you need to move on and do what's best in life for you and your own health, because things aren't just going to get better by leaving them on their own. I still feel incredibly sad and almost empty after a rewatch of this trilogy, because it really is just that powerful of a story, and nothing I've ever seen has ever come close to this level of perfection. So these 6 things, these ultra important 6 things of what made this trilogy so great, and what modern day Lord of the Rings, and really modern day fantasy in general, is lacking, if they really concentrate on these things, would Lord of the Rings and fantasy get better again? Maybe. But the truth is, all of these points can be viewed with all sorts of different lenses. I'm sure the Rings of Power went through all sorts of pre-production to be ready for whatever's ahead. I'm sure they think that they're staying true to Tolkien's work and creating an emotionally resonant story. They think they've got all these points nailed, and to some people, I'm sure they do. To some people, I'm sure Lord of the Rings will continue to be a great franchise, that there hasn't been a bad minute of screen time in anything whatsoever. But to a lot of people, that's not true, and if they continue along this path that they're on right now, things might not get better and it could tarnish the legacy of this trilogy. But the truth of all that is, that's not going to happen. Nothing is ever going to tarnish the legacy of this trilogy. Nothing is ever going to take away from these 3 movies and the work that went into them by hundreds and thousands of people. I mentioned Star Wars back in the beginning of the video and how its legacy might be tarnished, but that's not true either. People will always hold the original trilogy in the highest regard. It doesn't matter what's come after. Those 3 movies will always be special and magical for those that love them, and the same will be true for the Lord of the Rings. They could even pull a stunt like this, and it still wouldn't take away from this trilogy. Stories and the love that you have for them don't die because more gets added to them. They die because the love you had for them was never real in the first place. And that's the difference between something like the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Rings of Power. That's the difference between the Lord of the Rings and modern day fantasy stories. You love this trilogy and you just wish that there was something else that came along that could reignite that same love. Alright. That's the video, everyone. Thanks for watching this far, and let me know what some other points you have as to why this trilogy was so great. Special thanks to all my channel members. Subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.
Yeah.